Imagine a single person managing to set an entire global superpower's scientific progress back by like a half century. And we are not talking about, a catastrophic lab accident or a sudden loss of funding. We are talking about sheer political willpower, systematically fabricated data, and just an incredibly bizarre set of pseudoscientific theories that somehow got elevated to undeniable law.
Yeah, it really is a staggering historical reality.
Yeah.
You have one individual essentially rewriting the fundamental laws of biology for an entire nation. And he's doing it with the full lethal backing of the state apparatus.
Right, which is just wild. So in today's deep dive, we are exploring a comprehensive biographical source that details the life of Trofim Lysenko. We'll be examining his unbelievable trajectory from an obscure, uneducated peasant agronomist to the absolute dictator of Soviet biology.
Exactly. Our mission today is really to unpack the mechanics of how an unproven set of, well, radical theories became a state-sanctioned doctrine.
Yeah, and just a quick note before we dive into the text. The source material today touches heavily on politically charged history involving the Soviet Union, forced state policies, and fierce ideological battles. We want to be very clear that we are impartially reporting the historical facts here. We're just conveying the ideas exactly as they are contained in the source material without taking any political sides.
Right, we're looking strictly at the historical record provided just to understand the anatomy of a scientific collapse. We want to analyze what happens structurally when, the scientific method is entirely replaced by political convenience.
Because the core question that jumped out at me while I was going through these sources is almost absurd on its face. I mean, how does someone who vehemently denies the very existence of genes end up as the director of an institute of genetics?
Well, to understand that massive leap, we have to look at the exact moment in history when Lysenko actually appeared. In the late 1920s and early 30s, the Soviet Union was facing a desperate, real-world crisis, and this was triggered by collectivist agricultural reforms.
Oh.
The state had forced the confiscation of land from individual peasant farmers to create these massive, state-run collective farms. And this abrupt upheaval completely devastated the country's food production.
Yeah, and the sources describe a situation that went way beyond just mere bureaucratic inefficiency. We are talking about massive famine, severe crop failures, and just widespread starvation.
And the government leadership was acutely aware that this wasn't simply a weather problem or, a bad harvest cycle. It was a severe human problem.
Right.
Disenfranchised peasants were actively resisting the collectivization. I mean, they were abandoning the farms altogether or slaughtering their own livestock in protest, or intentionally doing really poor quality work because they no longer had any personal stake in the crop yields.
That makes sense.
So the state was facing an existential threat and desperately needed a quick, miraculous fix to feed the nation and, crucially, re-engage the furious agricultural workforce.
Enter Trofim Lysenko. I mean, the source paints a picture of a man who was the absolute antithesis of the traditional ivory tower academic.
Oh, completely. He was born into a peasant family of Ukrainian ethnicity and only learned to read and write at the age of 13. And in the eyes of the state leadership, particularly Joseph Stalin, that lack of formal education wasn't a liability. It was actually his greatest asset.
Because of the political climate, right?
Exactly. The Communist Party was actively pushing policies to rapidly promote members of the proletariat into leadership positions. They harbored a really deep suspicion of formally trained, university-educated scientists. They viewed them as a lingering symptom of the old bourgeois elite.
Right, because in that era, having an academic degree was essentially putting a target on your back. Yeah. It actually reminds me of the worst kind of modern corporate panic.
How so?
Well, the leadership is terrified over plummeting quarterly numbers, so they bring in this charismatic outside consultant who promises to double profits using synergy and sheer willpower, completely bypassing actual math.
That is a shockingly accurate comparison.
Right. But only in this historical case, the consultant's bad advice resulted in the starvation of millions. And his big magical fix, according to the source, was a process called vernalization.
Yeah, so vernalization involved taking winter wheat seeds, which typically require planting in the fall, so they can experience the winter cold before germinating, and artificially chilling and soaking them.
Okay.
Lysenko claimed that by doing this, he could plant them in the spring, and they would somehow behave like spring cereals. The big promise was that this would bypass the severe cold and lack of snow that had been destroying early winter wheat seedlings. It would guarantee crop survival and allow for year-round agricultural work.
But the concept of chilling seeds wasn't actually a new invention, was it?
Not at all. Farmers and botanists had known about it since the 19th century.
Okay, so what was his angle?
The wild part is that Lysenko was claiming miraculous inherited results from this basic agricultural trick. He asserted that once you treated the seeds, the subsequent generations of that wheat would permanently retain that cold resistance.
Which is just, I mean, that is where the genuine science ended and the outright fraud really began. Because early on, the source mentions a respected plant expert named Nikolai Vavilov who confronted Lysenko, right? Because Lysenko's statistical analysis of this vernalization process was just riddled with basic errors.
Yes. Lysenko was attempting to measure plant development by simply tallying the days past and the temperature on those specific days. He wasn't correctly calculating actual thermal heat accumulation over time.
And Lysenko's reaction to being corrected on his math wasn't just like a quirky defense mechanism. It was the foundational step in rewriting biology from scratch. He didn't just argue his calculations, he boldly declared that mathematics had no place in biology whatsoever.
Which is an incredible claim. Because if you throw out statistical probability and rigorous data tracking, you are throwing out the entire foundation of classical genetics.
And the political leadership just allowed him to do it.
They did. Because Lysenko's methods supposedly motivated the peasants to get back out into the fields, the state didn't care about the mathematical errors. The overarching political narrative was that this intuitive proletarian science was vastly superior to rigid Western academic methods.
Wow. So by rejecting math, he basically cleared the runway to invent his own biological reality, which became known as Maturinist genetics.
Right. He named it partially after an earlier Russian agronomist, Ivan Michurin, but the core doctrines were entirely Lysenko's creation. He completely denied the existence of DNA and genes. He dismissed Gregor Mendel's proven theories of genetic inheritance as idealist and reactionary.
So what did he replace it with?
He leaned heavily into ideas similar to Lamarckism.
Okay, remind me what that is.
It's the discredited belief that an organism can pass on characteristics it acquired during its lifetime directly to its offspring. Lysenko argued that the entire body of an organism is soma-determined heredity. In his view, genetic variation and spontaneous mutation were completely fictional.
So if you forced a plant to survive cold weather during its life, its seeds would just naturally inherit cold resistance.
Exactly.
The philosophical alignment there is really fascinating. Maturinist genetics framed nature as infinitely malleable, which perfectly mirrored the state's framing of human nature. Like, if society could be rapidly engineered into a collective utopia, then biology must be capable of the same rapid engineering.
That's spot on. He was projecting human political ideals directly onto the natural world. And when biology inevitably refused to behave according to those political ideals, Lysenko simply invented new, increasingly absurd realities.
Oh, the source material is full of these bizarre practices. I mean, he claimed that increasing a cow's milk production had nothing to do with selective breeding or genetics. He stated it was purely about the animal's treatment.
Yes.
Like, if you treated a cow well, its offspring would just magically be born with the capacity to produce more milk, which obviously taking good care of livestock is just basic farming practice, but it certainly doesn't rewrite an animal's genetic code.
And he extended this logic to plant life with his so-called law of the life of species. He genuinely believed that plants of the same class do not compete for resources, but actively help one another.
Wait, really?
Yes, which led him to instruct farmers to plant seeds dangerously close together.
Oh my gosh. He applied this class solidarity concept to Stalin's great plan for the transformation of nature, too. He ordered massive tree planting campaigns where saplings were planted in dense nests.
Right.
He literally claimed the trees would pool their energy, with the weaker ones supposedly sacrificing themselves so the central shoot could thrive and collectively fight off weeds. He was literally applying the concept of human self-sacrifice to oak trees.
It's incredible.
Yeah.
But Lysenko's attempt to explain away brood parasitism might be the most glaring example of this madness.
Oh, the cuckoo birds.
Yes. The biological reality of brood parasitism, where birds like cuckoos lay their eggs in the nests of warblers to be raised by the unsuspecting hosts, relies on strict genetic species distinction. Well, Lysenko looked at this and deduced that the warblers were actually giving birth to cuckoos because the parent birds fed them hairy caterpillars.
What? Because of what they ate.
Exactly. He completely erased the biological boundary between species just to avoid admitting that genetic inheritance was real.
That is, diet changes your species. Wow. He even supported an associate, Olga Lepeshinskaya, who claims she could grow living, dividing cells out of completely non-cellular matter, like mashed egg yolks.
Yes, he backed her because her claims undermined modern cytology, which relied on observable cell division and meiosis.
But this brings us to a massive structural question. If these methods were actively destroying crops like planting seeds so close together they just choke each other out, how did he maintain his grip on power? I mean, how did he hide the failures? Where was the data coming from?
That goes back to the Soviet collective system. Farm managers were given almost impossible crop quotas by the state. If they failed to meet those quotas, they faced severe punishment, often deportation to the Gulag. And Lysenko never ran controlled, observable experiments in a laboratory. Instead, he relied on questionnaires sent out to these terrified collective farm managers.
So the questionnaires basically functioned as a survival mechanism for the farmers. If a farm manager claimed their yields miraculously improved by using Lysenko's methods, they met their ideological quota even if the real crops were failing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The state-mandated confirmation bias. A perfect example from the source is his method for summer potato planting in the South to stop what he called the degeneration of the potatoes.
Right.
When the process inevitably failed in the harsh climate, Lysenko instructed the farmers to bury the harvested potatoes in trenches layered with soil. Well, the lack of ventilation caused massive widespread rotting of the food supply.
Naturally.
But because the data was self-reported by farm managers trying to avoid prison, the failures were systematically hidden. Only the fabricated successes were published in the scientific journals, which, of course, Lysenko himself controlled and edited.
So the mechanism wasn't just fear, it was a closed loop of systemic fraud. And as the agricultural reality continued to deteriorate, Lysenko couldn't simply rely on faking data anymore. He had to pivot from just conducting bad science to actively destroying the good scientists who had the expertise to expose him.
Right. And it's important to know that before Lysenko's rise in the 1930s, the Soviet Union possessed arguably the most advanced genetics community in the entire world. They were pioneering legitimate, groundbreaking research.
Again, he just gutted it.
Systematically, he dismantled that entire scientific infrastructure. As his political power solidified, scientific debate was entirely replaced by ideological purges.
He targeted traditional Western-leaning geneticists, framing their work as an ideological threat. Because modern genetics relied heavily on the study of fruit flies to observe rapid generational changes, Lysenko disparagingly branded these brilliant researchers as fly lovers and people haters.
It sounds like a petty, almost childish insult, but it carried lethal consequences. The definitive turning point was the infamous August 1948 session of the Agricultural Academy, known as VASKHNIL. This week-long session was fully endorsed by Stalin.
Right.
By its conclusion, Lysenkoism was officially declared the only correct theory of Soviet biology. Scientists in attendance were forced into public confessions denouncing their own life's work. They were required to state that Morganist genetics, referring to the Nobel-winning work of Thomas Hunt Morgan, was an ideologically alien movement serving the bourgeois class.
And if you didn't renounce your research and swear loyalty to Lysenko's doctrine, you were stripped of your positions, left destitute, or worse.
Woo.
Which really brings us to the profound tragedy of Nikolai Vavilov. His story anchors the human cost of this whole era.
Yes.
Vavilov wasn't just any botanist. He was a brilliant visionary who had spent his life traveling the globe to build the world's largest seed bank. He was genuinely trying to end famine permanently.
And the tragic irony is that Vavilov actually recognized Lysenko's early ambition and mentored him. He supported Lysenko's initial vernalization experiments, hoping the technique might have practical applications for his own complex crossbreeding programs.
But as
Lysenko's claims grew increasingly fraudulent and just devoid of scientific rigor, Vavilov could no longer stomach the pseudoscience and withdrew his support.
the betrayal is just heartbreaking. I mean, Vavilov defended Lysenko before Lysenko possessed the power to sign his death warrant. And for the crime of standing by observable reality, Vavilov was arrested in 1940 while on a botanical expedition. He was subjected to months of brutal interrogation, thrown into prison, and died of starvation in 1943.
It's horrifying.
The man who dedicated his entire existence to ending global starvation was starved to death by his own government. And dozens of other prominent geneticists met similar fates, either executed or exiled to labor camps.
It really forces us to look in the mirror and consider what happens to a society when scientific truth becomes a strict political loyalty test. You don't just lose agricultural yields, you lose the fundamental capacity for critical thought. Acknowledging a crop failure under Lysenko's regime wasn't viewed as identifying a scientific error to be corrected. It was prosecuted as an act of treason against the Soviet state.
You literally couldn't say the wheat died without risking a firing squad. It's like the referees suddenly deciding that not only are the rules of the game different, but anyone caught playing by the old rules goes straight to jail. But reality is stubborn. You can fabricate thousands of questionnaires, but you cannot fabricate calories.
Very true.
The consequences of these forced, unscientific practices couldn't be contained forever, and eventually the agricultural disaster breached the borders of the Soviet Union.
Yes. The impact became terrifyingly global. Through the mid-1950s, Chinese agricultural methods were heavily influenced by Lysenko's doctrines, which were enthusiastically adopted by Mao Zedong. The policy of close planting, directly mimicking Lysenko's theory that plants of the same class don't compete, was implemented on a massive scale across China.
Right, so seeds were packed so densely into the soil that the fields essentially suffocated. The crops rotted before they could even grow.
And historians deeply analyze this period and contend that these Lysenko-inspired practices heavily contributed to the devastating severity of the Great Chinese Famine from 1959 to 1962. We're talking about a disaster that resulted in the deaths of tens of millions of people. It is a staggering demonstration of the human suffering caused when a government refuses to admit they backed a scientifically bankrupt ideology.
It makes you wonder how the illusion finally shattered. I mean, Stalin died in 1953, but Lysenko didn't immediately lose his grip on power. The new leader, Nikita Khrushchev, was also heavily invested in the agricultural narrative and continued to offer his full support.
That's right. Stalin's death did, however, create a slight political thaw. By 1955, mainstream biologists who had somehow survived the purges felt a faint glimmer of hope. Over 300 scientists signed a comprehensive document that became known as the Letter of 300.
Wow.
They sent it directly to Khrushchev to detail the sheer devastation Lysenko had wrought on Soviet biology. This monumental effort forced a temporary resignation, but Khrushchev ultimately protected Lysenko and reinstated him.
So the biological community tried to cure the infection and failed, but the final blow, and this is perhaps the most fascinating twist in the entire narrative, didn't come from the biologists. The spell was finally broken by the physicists.
Yes. In 1962, three highly prominent Soviet physicists, Yakov Zheltovich, Vitaly Ginzburg, and Pyotr Kapitsa, built a rigorous case against Lysenko, publicly declaring his work to be outright pseudoscience.
Okay.
2 years later, in 1964, the renowned nuclear physicist Andrei Sakharov stood before the General Assembly of the Academy of Sciences and completely eviscerated Lysenko's legacy.
Sakharov just unleashed decades of pent-up scientific fury. He openly blamed Lysenko for the shameful backwardness of Soviet biology, for the deliberate degradation of public learning, and for the defamation, false arrest, and deaths of genuine, brilliant scientists. The bravery required to say that out loud in a Soviet assembly is awe-inspiring. But why did it take nuclear physicists to accomplish what the biologists couldn't?
It came down to untouchable prestige and absolute political leverage. These physicists were the architects of the Soviet nuclear weapons program. During the height of the Cold War, the state's very survival depended entirely on its atomic shield. Because the government absolutely needed the bomb, the physicists were granted a level of intellectual freedom and physical protection that biologists simply did not possess. They could speak unvarnished truth to power because they knew the state couldn't afford to send them to the gulag.
That is absolutely wild. Nuclear deterrence actually provided the cover needed to save biology. So once Khrushchev was dismissed from power in late 1964, Lysenko's political immunity completely vanished. An expert commission was finally allowed to rigorously investigate his highly secretive experimental farm in the Lenin Hills.
Right, and the sheer scale of his fraudulent methods was exposed to the public light, leading to his official disgrace and removal in 1965. He spent his remaining years in obscurity before dying in 1976. The arc of Trofim Lysenko is a dark, tragic chapter, but analyzing it is vital. We saw how a perfect storm of agricultural desperation, political convenience, and the absolute rejection of rigorous methodology allowed a dangerous pseudoscience to thrive unchecked. It cost millions of lives and set back an entire field of study by decades.
Which brings us to why this history matters to you, navigating the modern world. We live in an age of intense information overload, surrounded by highly polarized, emotionally charged debates. Lysenko's story serves as a chilling, timeless reminder to scrutinize the mechanics of the information you consume. It demands that you question how data is actually collected and verified.
Exactly.
It urges you to pay close attention to who is attempting to silence the opposition rather than debate them. And most importantly, it asks you to relentlessly question whether you are accepting a theory simply because it provides a comforting narrative or aligns perfectly with an ideological convenience.
Because a society must fiercely protect the space for evidence-based dissent and rigorous peer review. The moment scientific reality is subordinated to political optics, we lose our collective grip on the truth. And the consequences, as history clearly shows, are catastrophic.
Think about the immense web of scientific consensus we rely on in our daily lives, from medical treatments to the safety of our infrastructure. If an entire global superpower's agricultural reality could be dismantled and rewritten by a single charismatic figure who simply declared that genes don't exist, what foundational truths in our modern, algorithm-driven world might be similarly vulnerable? If the right mixture of viral popularity and political convenience align tomorrow, could a new form of pseudoscience take root just as easily? We love to believe that the lens of modern science is an infallible shield, that the jagged, objective line of truth will always remain visible. But as Trofim Lysenko showed the world, if the people holding the levers of power decide that the truth is ideologically unacceptable, you might just find yourself planting trees to fight weeds while the crops silently rot in the ground.